Let me go on record right off the bat by saying how happy I am that Congressman Meeks and I decided to have haircuts at the same day. All right. Okay. Are you ready? Yeah. Okay. I call this hearing to order. Just over 2 months ago, this subcommittee met for a hearing focused on Turkey's democratic decline, the second such hearing that has been held by this committee. 8 days later, an attempt was made to overthrow the AKP government, and during the chaos and conflict on the night of July 15th, over 240 Turkish civilians were killed and the Turkish parliament bombed from the air. As one might expect, this and the following upheaval that followed it has been a traumatic experience for the people of Turkey. Let them have no doubts, however, the United States stands by them in our support for democracy and the rule of law. President Obama has made that clear on July 15th, and that remains the case. Unfortunately, great damage has been done, and great damage has been done as part of the coup attempt, but at the same time, President Erdogan has been making a bad situation worse by using the failed coup as an opportunity to expand his own political power. In short, after the coup collapsed, a state of emergency was declared, and the government began arresting a wide range of opponents that had nothing to do with the coup. Journalists, secularists, military officers, government officials who did not agree with President Erdogan's vision for Turkey, they were arrested, 10,000 of them, and they've been arrested, and a number of them have been tortured. The Turkish government is blaming its travail on, and I can't pronounce his first name, Fethullah Gulen, okay, there it is, a Turkish religious philosopher living in exile on a Pennsylvania farm. The claim that he personally planned and ordered the coup has been accepted by many Turkish citizens, despite the lack of substantial evidence to indicate that. To this effect, I don't find such charges to be credible, and I believe that the Turkish government has erred by proclaiming anyone and everyone involved in the Gülenist religious movement to be part of a conspiracy that put on the coup. Again, over perhaps 100,000 civil servants, military officers, teachers, policemen, prosecutors, even judges have been removed from their job, and many of them have been arrested. They have been replaced by Erdogan's cronies, by political opportunists, and yes, by even Muslim Brotherhood radicals and other Islamic fascists. As one example of how far these ridiculous purges have gone, the Turkish soccer authorities announced they have fired 94 officials, including a number of soccer referees, for their ties to the coup. Over 20,000 people, or whatever that exact number is, it's in the tens of thousands, have been arrested. And the government of Turkey has used this coup to settle old scores and to clean out of their house those it does not seem or deem sufficiently loyal to Erdogan's vision for Turkey. Incredibly, it was reported last month that Turkey would release 38,000 criminals from prison to make room for those taken into custody in these purges, letting murderers, rapists, thieves go in order to make room for political opponents. I don't think it doesn't get much worse than that. As we have in our conversations about recent events in Turkey, I want to underline my desire to see Turkey become an economically strong partner of the United States that is at peace both at home and with its neighbors. The Turks have been wonderful allies of the American people. And as we're going through this testimony today, and we're seeing what the current regime in Turkey is doing, which is heavy-handed and wrong, let's not forget that the Turkish people themselves have been so loyal to us. We must wish them well and do what we can to try to help them through this confusing time period. It means that Turkey, as I say, needs, in order to do that and for us to succeed and for them to succeed, Turkey needs to have strong democratic institutions, a free press, and a country in which people abide by the rule of law. The government's current witch hunt that sees disloyal Gulenists behind every door is bound to backfire even in the short run, but be disastrous in the long run. The fear and tension created by a thuggish coup and by a heavy-handed response does not and is not serving the Turkish people well. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing here today, and without objection, their written statements will be made part of the record, and all members will have at least 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions or extraneous materials for the record. Now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Meeks, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, for calling today's hearing on Turkey and giving us an opportunity to discuss the attempted coup and its consequences for Turkey and the United States and Turkey's relationship. Clearly, the coup was a traumatic shock to the system. I can recall when it was taking place, looking at my television screen in disbelief. So it is clear, and I agree with Mr. Rohrabacher in this aspect. I stand in solidarity with the democratically elected Turkish government and against any violent attempts to overthrow it or any other democratically elected government. Democracy is important. We can't have coup d'etats. You've got to speak out against coup d'etats in order to have democratic order. When I think about over 270 people were killed as the parliament and ministries were attacked with helicopters and F-16s joining the fight, I can't even imagine such a scene here in Washington, D.C., soldiers firing into civilian crowds. We cannot, and I can't believe as members of Congress that is something that we want to see or can condone in any way. It is our job to respect and defend the democratic process. And a democratic Turkey is in everyone's best interest. Following the failed coup, there's been a big issue of Mr. Gulen, his residency in Pennsylvania, and his movement's involvement in the coup. And it has taken on an increasingly charged role in Turkish-U.S. relations. The United States is taking the accusations and requests for Mr. Gulen's extradition and detention very seriously. But as I say in democracies, there are processes. There are institutions. And there is a judicial process that is in place now, and a related treaty that will determine this outcome. So it's not something that can be done arbitrarily or capriciously or anything of that nature. There's a process that has to be had and should be. That's the reason why we have these institutions, and that's the reason why we have these treaties. So I say just linking the U.S. government to the coup, apart from being false, damages our important relationship And it's something that I deeply care about because the relationship between the United States and Turkey is very important. I understand that members of the Turkish government are understandably angry, but emotional statements and accusations will not expedite the judicial process. It has to run its course, as our judicial system demands. And perhaps as a result of the failed coup and subsequent purges, Turkey has markedly stepped up its fight against Daesh in Syria. Turkey is a NATO ally and plays an essential role in the region and has sought to mend relations with Russia and Israel. And while cooperation with those countries is welcome, Turkey's role in NATO and as host to over 1,500 U.S. troops remain especially important to the United States Congress. In our previous hearing on this topic, we discussed Turkey's democratic development, the Kurdish question, the role of civil society in Turkey. During the failed coup and afterwards, in an impressive show of unity, all Turkish political parties came to the defense of the elected government and even supported a search for those allegedly responsible for the coup, including Gülenists and members of Hazmet movement. Indeed, those found guilty should be rooted out of the government's organs and brought to justice. The state of emergency, however, must not be used to cover, to detain, arrest, and fire those with no responsibility for the coup. How many judges, teachers, and businessmen have been found innocent and allowed to return to their posts? We must look at and analyze, because if you have nothing to do with this, and you're found innocent, as I'm sure there are many individuals, they should be returned to their posts. Furthermore, are members of the legal pro-Kurdish movement, the HDP, being unjustly ensnared in a political war? As previously mentioned, we must protect the United States-Turkey relationship and simultaneously encourage strong democratic institutions and respect for the law. So for me, this is an important hearing to listen to these witnesses, to get your expert viewpoints on what is or is not taking place in Turkey, because it's important for us to decide as members of the United States Congress what we should or should not do, what we should or should not say. Just as I say that the Turkish parliament should not do things based upon emotion, I also believe that we in the United States Congress should not do something just based upon emotion. We need to try to figure out what the issues are and the facts are and move accordingly, because it is important for our relationship, and I think all over the world, that the U.S. and Turkey have a strong relationship. So I want to thank the witnesses in advance for their testimony and look forward to asking questions as we move forward. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. One of our members also has a 1-minute opening statement. Colonel Cook from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I think a number of us are worried about Turkey. Obviously, this is a Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. I'm also on the House Armed Services Committee. I'm also on the NATO Parliament. As already discussed, everybody knows that Turkey has been a key ally. It's a member of NATO. The Turkish Americans in my district throughout California, very, very close. The business climate, all those pluses. I think right now everybody's very, very nervous about the Erdogan government. Some of the things that are happening as we speak, obviously the relationship with the Kurds, the relationship with some of the Christians, and I'm not sure right now. I don't have that optimism about Mr. Erdogan. And this was well before the coup. And this is going to determine whether our military relations continue. We have a key base at Incirlik. We had problems before. We're going to see what happens after the coup. And we also have an impending sale of F-35s, the most advanced aircraft, and whether that will still be approved by the administration and Congress. That is something that's coming up there. So this coup and everything that's happened there, I'm not as optimistic as my colleague because of some of the mixed signals. But then you look at Israel, that a year or 2 years ago, they had severed diplomatic relations, and surprisingly enough, recently they've kind of normalized relations with Turkey. So hopefully we can get past this. Hopefully we can establish a dialogue with Mr. Erdogan, and hopefully we can have a democracy in a country right now where, in my opinion, it does not exist. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Today we have 4 excellent witnesses, and my direction would be, if, as usual, if you could get to the heart of the matter and give us 5 minutes of the basic information you think we need to know. The rest of your statement will be made part of the record, and we will proceed as with that in mind. And our first witness, and I will introduce all witnesses, and then you will testify. Nina, and again, I'm going to pronounce this Agni Onova. That's good enough. All right. And she is the coordinator for Europe and Central Asia programs for the Committee to Protect Journalists, where she has tracked developments in Turkey for the past several years. Previously, she worked as a writer for the International Journalist Network and earned a master's degree from Missouri School of Journalism. And next is Alan McCoskey, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. He's been with us several times, and I'm finally learning how to pronounce his name. And he is a private think tank, of course, the Center for American Progress, and it's here in Washington, D.C. And for more than a decade, he served as a senior professional staff member right here. So we give him a little leeway, that right, on the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, covering the Middle East, Turkey, and the other problems that we tackled in this committee. Before that, he directed the Washington Institute's Turkey Research Program and was an employee of the State Department. We have next Ahmet Yala. Good, got it. And he is a professor, an adjunct professor at the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society at George Mason University, and the Deputy Director of International Center for the Study of Violent Extremism. He has a long career as a Turkish law enforcement officer and served as chief of the Anti-Terrorism Division of the Turkish National Police. And he has earned his master's degree and PhD degrees from the University of North Texas. And he is a author of a recent book, and I would ask you to give us the title of your book during your testimony. See, there you go. Okay. And then there's Aaron Stein, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rifki Harari Center for Middle East, where Harari, okay, Middle East, where it, and because this institute follows and comments on developments in Turkey and in the region. Dr. Stein received his PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies at King's College in London. Does that mean you're English? No, American. Oh, there, all right. So we'll start on this end, and we will then, after 5-minute presentations, open up for questions from the panel. Okay.
Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on press freedom in Turkey after the July 15th coup attempt. My name is Nina Ognyanova, and I'm the Eurasia Program Coordinator at the Committee to Protect Journalists. We are a press freedom organization dedicated to defending the rights of journalists worldwide, and it is an honor to speak with you today. My oral statement will be a summary of my written statement, which contains extended analysis and specific examples of press freedom violations in Turkey. On July 15th, military officers attempted to overthrow Turkey's elected government. Thousands of Turks took to the streets to defend it, and more than 200 were killed. In this crucial moment, Turkey's usually polarized society was united. The AKP received overwhelming support from across the political spectrum, but instead of channeling that support to bridge differences, authorities have been using the failed putsch to purge their opponents, mounting a sweeping crackdown on the critical media when Turkey most needs a plurality of voices. The government immediately blamed the coup on the Hizmet movement, followers of preacher Fethullah Gülen, whom the Turkish government accuses of leading a terrorist organization. Gülen has denied all accusations. Within days after the putsch, the AKP announced a state of emergency that allowed it to govern by decree. Within a few weeks, the government had closed down more than 100 media, including broadcasters, newspapers, magazines, publishers, and distribution companies, and it had detained over 100 journalists. At least 30 news websites were censored by state regulators. Some journalists have managed to escape into exile, but other passports, they were cancelled to prevent their departure. Judges suspected of having ties to Hizmet were purged and replaced with AKP loyalists. The Prime Minister's office has revoked the press credentials of over 600 journalists. In mid-August, CPJ's 2016 International Press Freedom Awardee recipient, Can Dündar, resigned his editorship of the daily Cumhuriyet and said he would not return to Turkey while the state of emergency was in effect. Trusting the judiciary, Dündar said, would be like laying one's head on the guillotine. The scope of the purge has spread far beyond the requirements of the safety and security of the Turkish state. With all the media outlets perceived as tied to Gülen already shuttered, and with the list of journalists arrested for once having worked at these media growing by the day, the purge has now moved on to individual critics of both the government and the Hizmet movement, and the long-standing judicial and police harassment of the Kurdish media has intensified. The state of emergency has given security agencies the right to detain individuals for up to 30 days without access to a judge, which has created conditions in which detainees are at risk of abuse. In my written testimony, I have described several cases of reported police abuse of journalists in custody, and all of these abuses have been carried out with impunity. CPJ is dismayed at the cancellation of a growing number of journalists' passports. This punitive measure has been extended to the family members of the accused. In one disturbing recent case, on September 3rd, Can Dündar's wife, Dilek, here in the picture, was prevented from traveling to Europe to visit her husband in exile. Security officers confiscated her passport without giving any reason. She has not been charged with a crime. So the only explanation for this official action is that she is being punished for her husband's journalism. There is much that remains unclear about the July 15 coup attempt, but instead of allowing Turkish journalists to do their job and to investigate the truth about this conspiracy, the government is making the press pay the price for the illegal actions of rogue military officers. Turkey's domestic purge of its media has international repercussions. Credible, independent media reports are vital for the world's understanding of Turkey's handling of the Syrian refugee crisis or the battle against the Islamic State. While it is important to condemn the coup attempt, we strongly urge US leaders to condemn the continuing purge of opposition and independent media. The US should allow Turkish journalists caught in the post-coup purge to travel to the United States. CPJ awardee Can Dündar hopes to travel to New York in November to receive his award. The US should not honor Turkish arrest warrants for journalists and should encourage other countries not to honor those warrants as well, and should treat journalists' travel documents as valid, even if Turkey has already canceled them. We urge Congress to consider imprisoned Turkish journalists as prisoners of conscience, including the more than 100 journalists detained in the aftermath of the failed coup. A plunge into naked authoritarianism risks destabilizing Turkey, which is a vital US ally. Putting an end to the ever-broadening crackdown on independent media is a vital step towards stopping and reversing that plunge before it becomes too late. Thank you for providing CPJ with the opportunity to address you today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mikowski.
Chairman Rohrabacher, rank.
And if-
Yeah, forgot to turn it on. Second time in a row I've done that. Yeah, I told you I wasn't on this side of the table before. Anyway, I'll start again. Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, esteemed members of the subcommittee, it's an honor to have been invited back to testify here today on this important topic. Maybe I'll get it right this time. Mr. Chairman, any discussion of the post-coup environment in Turkey must begin with an acknowledgement that Turkish society endured an enormous trauma on July 15th, as you and the ranking member and Mr. Brooks all said, Mr. Cook, I'm sorry, all said in your opening remarks. As well, I think we should acknowledge that the U.S., and for that matter, European Union response to the coup was less than optimal, inadvertently feeding conspiracy-mindedness in Turkey. That said, it is now 2 full months since the coup, and it is more than fair to take stock of the Turkish government's reaction. That reaction has been found wanting in 3 major ways. First of all, the vastness and persistence of the purge of the civil service, which you have detailed in your opening remarks, the arrest of journalists, the closure of media outlets, the arrests for spurious reasons. Many of these arrests having nothing whatsoever, of people having nothing whatsoever to do with Gulen or Gulenis, has turned a somewhat understandable initial desire to err on the side of caution into an unbridled witch hunt. Even President Erdogan recently expressed some concern about how vast this is, and he said to governors, you should not vie with one another to see who can arrest more people. And this is happening against a background of growing authoritarianism in Turkey that predates the coup attempt, as we discussed at our previous hearing. Second, even in ostensibly pursuing post-coup unity, President Erdogan's approach has been divisive. Revulsion at the coup attempt and justifiable pride in thwarting it through popular action united many Turks in the coup's immediate aftermath. However, government-led post-coup efforts at healing were in fact themselves divisive, excluding the party that most Kurds in Turkey's southeast support, the People's Democracy Party, or HDP, in fact, the 3rd largest party in parliament. For example, HDP has been excluded from talks on a new Turkish constitution, and it was excluded from the emotional August 7th Istanbul rally that attracted millions of Turks supporting democracy and condemning the coup. Third, the Turkish government has engaged in anti-US scapegoating following the coup attempt, primarily through means of the heavily pro-government media, which has repeatedly blamed the coup attempt on the US government and various US citizens, both public and private. The government has reinforced this scapegoating by raising suspicions regarding Fethullah Gulen's longtime residence in the United States and by leading the Turkish public to expect the United States to deliver Mr. Gulen to Turkey quickly, with little acknowledgement that extradition is a lengthy process that can only be successfully achieved with hard evidence. According to a generally reliable Turkish poll taken during the 3rd week of August, 1/4 of Turks believe that the United States was behind the coup, whereas 55% believe Gulen was the mastermind. That means 1/4 believe we were much more behind it than even Gulen. Anecdotal evidence, I would say, however, suggests that far more than 1/4 believe the U.S. had at least indirect involvement in or prior knowledge of the coup attempt. According to the same poll, 90% of Turks now have an unfavorable view of the U.S., with only 9% favorable. Looking ahead, it is clear that President Erdogan is now a far more dominant ruler even than he was before the coup attempt. He is also likely to remain a difficult partner for the United States. I don't believe Turkey wants to leave NATO, nor should we want it to do so. But President Erdogan's Turkey is likely to push the boundaries of partnership at times and use its reborn relationship with Russia, as well as manipulated anti-Americanism at home, as leverage with us on bilateral issues. Two final points quickly, Mr. Chairman, if I may. A good relationship with Turkey remains a highest priority U.S. national interest, but we should not turn a blind eye to Turkey's deteriorating human rights situation, nor conveniently forget that this deterioration began well before the July 15th coup attempt. Second, and finally, more broadly, we must remain alert to the possibility that Turkey could indeed drift from the Western alliance. I do not believe that will happen, but given the many strains on U.S.-Turkish bilateral relations, the possibility of Turkey turning away from the West is now sufficiently plausible that it would be wrong not to plan for that contingency. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you for that word of warning. Next, we have Mr. Yala.
Thank you very much. Dear Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Mix.
Speak right into that microphone.
Okay. Dear Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Mix, members of the subcommittee, and ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to testify before you today. Since we have 5 minutes, I have detailed in my written statement, but I would like to go over a few critical points very fast. I think it is critical to understand the coup conditions in Turkey, especially in regards to President Erdogan. The economy before the coup was suffering very deeply. The tourism industry was almost dead after the several terrorist attacks. After the shoot down of Russian airplane, the sanctions put on Turkey by Putin was deteriorating economy was very badly, especially tourism suffered a lot. And after 2013, December criminal charges against the government, the rule of law started to mean nothing, and several international businesses and investors left Turkey, like Tesco, PayPal also. And freedom of speech, free media, and the rule of law started to mean nothing in Turkey, basically eroding the foundations of democracy in Turkey. Turkey was going through tough times, and the relationship with the West, with the EU and NATO was deteriorating. Erdogan, as the gatekeeper of ISIS, kept threatening the EU with the sending of several thousand refugees to the European countries. The US was upset with Turkey's failed commitment to fight with ISIS and its Erdogan's or Turkey's illicit open and hidden support to ISIS. For example, the leader of Turkish ISIS, Halis Bayancuk, was released from the prison almost a year ago, and right now he freely operates inside Turkey without any problems. Just a week ago, suspects of Sultanahmet Blue Mosque ISIS suicide attack were released from prison. If you look at the arrests of those ISIS people, ISIS suspects, when they got arrested, somehow they are not handcuffed. But if you look at the journalists, when they got arrested, they are handcuffed from the back. So that's the approach of the government, unfortunately, if we compare the ISIS members and the journalists or other people getting arrested. Another problem was the Zarrab case. Right now, Zarrab, an Iranian-Turkish businessman in New York Federal, being tried in New York Federal Court, and he was the key person to Turkey's oil to gold scheme, which was managed by the government, and Zarrab was managing that, and right now being tried for money laundering, bank fraud, and evading sanctions against Iran. And that person was arrested during 2013 corruption charges raised by Istanbul police, whom Erdogan backed up very furiously and whom pledged to Erdogan's wife's foundation millions of dollars. Close circles of Erdogan, his sons were being named dealing with ISIS oil on the media. And Erdogan could not produce a diploma, university diploma, which was being circulated on the social media against him. It was very obvious that Erdogan would not be able to reach his goal through democratic means with all those troubles, as the polls showed that his support was diminishing. When we look at the aftermath of the coup, I have spent almost 20 years as the chief of counterterrorism and operations in Turkey. And I know the capacity of government officers and counterterrorism or the police. As the police was dealing with the coup attempters, the security services and intelligence, all of a sudden, after 3 hours, Erdogan left Atatürk airport. We had a list of 1653 military officers whom were deemed as the perpetrators of the coup, and whom almost 90% of them were not on the field. And all of a sudden, the security services in 3 hours found ways to investigate the coup attempt. They analyzed the evidences they had. They made a list of 1,653 military officers all over Turkey. They got warrants for those officers and distributed those warrants to 81 provinces all over Turkey in 3-4 hours. And then the police somehow started to arrest those people in their homes or at their vacation places. And from technical perspective, it would take months, not weeks. So it is very clear that that list was pre-arranged. And also we can see that at the prosecutors and judges list who were fired, they fired immediately 2,000 something prosecutors. One of the prosecutors were deceased 57 days at the time of his firing. So they fired someone who died 2 months ago. And we can see a lot of examples on that. For example, Saygı Öztürk, a prominent journalist, listed a few of them. The list the government had when they were firing the judges and prosecutors were prepared almost 2 years ago, because the cities where they were working were the cities where they were working 2 years ago. Another important aspect involves the purge, firing, and arrests. Over 100,000 people were fired, and almost 60,000 people were arrested and detained. And nobody knows how those lists were arranged and how those people were involved with the coup. Another important factor is the questions and inconsistencies of the statements of important key people after the coup. For example, the chief of staff, Akar, the Turkish National Intelligence Director came out and said that he informed Akar at 4 p.m. about the coup. However, Akar himself, he sit in his office up until 9 p.m. until he was arrested. He did not inform Erdogan, he did not inform the Prime Minister, nor he informed his commanders of the Air Force Army. The Air Force commander learned about the coup at a wedding in Istanbul. The commander of Gendarmerie learned about the coup in Ankara at a wedding. So this is a very questionable act on not letting know his superiors, President Erdogan and the Prime Minister and others. I would like to finish, as I am out of time. My book's name is ISIS Defectors Inside the Stories of the Terrorist Caliphate, and I would like to finish with one word. My son was arrested after I wrote an article on this issue in Turkey because my passport was cancelled. And the charges against my son is the reason that he was arrested, because my passport was cancelled. And I would like to give a story from Prophet Muhammad. One companion of Prophet Muhammad asked Prophet Muhammad, what is the biggest jihad? Because nowadays with ISIS, we hear a lot of stories about jihad. The Prophet Muhammad said a word of truth in front of a tyrant leader. Thank you.
Thank you, and we will keep your son in mind, and I hope whoever is reading this testimony in Turkey understands that We know who your son is, and it will not escape our attention if he is continued in captivity. Dr. Stein, would you like to proceed?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, other members of the committee, as well as my panelists for the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to dispense with reading my full statement and instead, in the interest of time, just focus on the main takeaways. I think the failed coup on July 15th, was obviously a very serious event, and I think the scale of the Turkish trauma has been underestimated in this country, even by people who say that they understand that this was a serious event. I think still, to a certain extent, underestimate what took place on July 15th. I also believe that the coup plotters themselves have been cast wrong. I don't think that they were these series of bumbling fools who made a series of errors. I think that they were very serious individuals. I think the coup attempt was larger than most people realized. It involved a number of different branches of the armed services from two different land armies, the Air Force, Special Operations Command, the Navy, and the Coast Guard. And I do think that there is enough evidence put forward in the Turkish press to say that there was Gülenist involvement, but there were also a lot of other people involved as well. The post-coup purges have obviously been very, very large. I believe the last count was 80,000 suspended, with some tens of thousands formally arrested. I think it's important to note that a lot of these purges have public support in Turkey. And that's because of the deep distrust amongst various elements of the Turkish, both electorate and people for Fethullah Gülen and his role in Turkish society. But I will say this, I think there are signs that this unity and this general support for the purges is beginning to pass. So if the rally around the flag, is always palpable in states or countries that undergo trauma, thinking about our own country after 9/11, it eventually does pass, and I think we are in that moment at the moment in Turkey. I do believe, however, that the sense of nationalism has been bolstered by two interrelated things. One is that there is a concurrent war going, or counterinsurgency, I should call it, in the southeast between the Turkish security forces and the PKK. And just to give a sense of how large that conflict is, it largely escapes international attention, is since July, there's been greater than 600 Turkish security personnel killed, and in a number of different cities that have been destroyed by fighting more than 500,000 IDPs. So this is independent of the Syria conflict as well. And the other is the instrumentalization of anti-Americanism. I agree with Mr. Makovsky that this has been instrumentalized and that this is largely a populist crutch that the Turkish government is using. One, because I believe, as public opinion poll has pointed out, that people do actually believe that the United States was involved in the coup. I think that was, it's far more widespread than most people realize. And if we weren't directly involved, because trying to explain the ins and outs of extradition law to any public, causes most people's eyes to glaze over and they flip the channel. And the other is that it's useful because it's always easier to blame the foreign other than it is to look internally to what was a very domestic Turkish event. The United States has nothing to do with the coup. We have nothing to do with the execution of Turkish domestic politics, with one exception, that Fethullah Gülen is a green card holder. The Turkish military I'll focus on, as I begin to wrap up, has absolutely been affected, and the operational readiness is nowhere near where it was before the coup began. 149 flag ranking officers have been purged, replaced with 99, so they are 50 short of admirals and generals than where we were on July 14th. The Air Force has plans to shutter 3 squadrons, perhaps in addition to 2 more, for a total of 5, which means that the operational readiness, or the commitments that they have in 3 different countries, their own, Iraq, and Syria, begin to come into question about how large a scale and how they can actually sustain current level of operations, both against ISIS and the PKK. And I think in closing, I think it's important for us all to realize that Turkey is actually unstable. And it's a very difficult ally, but nevertheless, it's an important ally. I mean, you can't really put your finger on anything that says this is why Turkey is absolutely instrumental for American interests abroad, except for the idea that NATO matters, transatlantic relations matter, especially at a time when that sort of fundamental aspect of American foreign policy is being called into question more and more about the value of overseas alliance. Thank you very much.
That last statement was interesting. Very important, and that we have to look. Turkey. I'm 69 years old. For those younger people out there who haven't been around that long, ever since I can remember, the Turks have always been at our side, and we've been at their side. What a tragedy to lose that goodwill and that sense of family that we've had with the Turks, and that's one of the reasons why, as over the years, there's been different controversies and areas of friction that have emerged, and I've always bent over backwards to try to be fair to my Turkish friends, because they are our friends. And unfortunately, we have now, from what I can see, is that the government of Turkey has gone way beyond its bounds of not only propriety, but of any type of acceptable response to what was an illegal and bloody and thuggish, as I say, coup attempt. And a thuggish coup attempt does not justify creating a dictatorship and a oppressive regime allied with radical Islamic forces and eliminating pro-Western people from areas of influence in their country. There is no justification for it, although we have to recognize, as all of our folks have, is they have gone through a trauma. However, that's where my line of questioning begins. I would suggest, I believe, that just what you can presume that this didn't just happen in terms of the response. This was not a response to something that happened. That response was in place. In other words, and I'll ask Mr. Yalal about this, you said that within a matter of hours, thousands of people were being arrested. Well, what does that indicate to you as a former officer in Turkish intelligence and law enforcement, that those arrests were ready to be made even before the coup? Isn't that correct?
Definitely. You cannot make a list, just a list of 1,653 people from the military as the police or as the intelligence, because the lists are not out there. So those lists were studied, analyzed, investigated, at least, in my experience, 6 months before. And in hours, very short term, while you are dealing with a trauma, with all your forces in the field fighting against the coup makers, with your intelligence and investigators on the streets, taking precautions and preventive measures, you cannot prepare a list of 1,653 military officers, and most of whom were not directly involved with the coup also. Several of them were taken from their vacation places. And there was not any indication that those people were related with the coup.
So we have all kinds of people who had nothing to do with the coup,
No.
who have been arrested, and we have obviously a list of people to be arrested long before the coup even
Definitely.
happened.
Yes. In the list, there were deceased people. There were several people wrongly listed, and they were already fired. Even though they were fired, they were relisted. So it also shows that the lists were pre-arranged because they fired people.
Right. I'd like to ask our first two witnesses to put this in perspective for us. Was there a major increase, because last time we had a hearing, that's one of the things we talked about, an increase of repression going on in Turkey before the coup? Did we see journalists arrested? Did we see newspapers closed? Did we see opposition parties or whatever suppressed before the coup?
I can speak about the situation with the press and the media. We have been following daily events, press freedom events in Turkey for years, but because of the magnitude of the crackdown, which had started months and months before the coup attempt, we were compelled to create a daily chronicle of those events. We started putting it out in March, which is when we thought that was the peak of repressions, when the Zaman, the Feza media group, which includes Zaman and a number of other big pro-Gulen media, were basically confiscated by the state.
And that's, when would that
That
happen?
was in March. And that was really a peak moment that we thought that this was the culmination of months and months before that of repressions. But we were wrong, because after we started this daily chronicle in March, we started reporting and documenting dozens of cases on a weekly basis.
Dozens of cases
Dozens of cases of violations of press freedom, including detentions of journalists, prosecutions on politically motivated charges, including terrorism charges, criminal charges, insult charges, the de facto imprisonment of detained journalists, the shuttering of media outlets, their
and Mr.
confiscation by the government, and their use for basically they became mouthpieces.
Thank you. We see that in the press area, there was this repression a long time before the coup.
Long time
So
before.
no matter how thuggish the coup was, that can't be an excuse for the tyranny that happened even before it. And as we heard from the witness, was probably arranged, the thousands of people were probably arranged even before there was a coup. Manikowski, what about she had the press, what about other opposition parties, et cetera? Did we have that type of repression before the coup?
Yeah, absolutely. I would, thank you. I would fully associate myself with Ms. Agnianova's remarks, and as I testified last time, media repression in Turkey has been going on for years, and a lot of it has been very insidious and not so visible. In-house censorship, a lot of self-censorship, many firings have been going on for a long time. I think most people who work on Turkey in this town have many friends who suffered as a result, journalist friends, and suffered well long before the coup. I wonder, Mr. Chairman, if it's the appropriate time, I was going to say a word or two about the Gulen movement and the...
You know what, let's hold that off until the other questions, but I will suggest, unless one of my colleagues would like to ask specifically about it, but if it does not get covered in the questions, we will come back and I will be asking all of you what specifically you believe about the Gulenist movement. Is it indeed a conspiratorial movement that tries to in some way capture power from a democratically elected government? And do you have one comment on whether or not this repression that came immediately after the coup and what we've been talking about was in some way already in place before the coup?
I would agree with most of the statements from the colleagues. Yes, because it was in place of when the Gulen movement and the AKP had their political falling out in December 2013. So I would say beginning in January 2014 was when you had what we would call purges beginning. And so yes, those lists were already there because the targeting of the Gulen movement and its listing as a terrorist organization in Turkey had already taken place before that.
Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, the falling out that the Gulenist movement supported Erdogan prior to, well, when he was first coming to power politically, and the falling out they had was after the Gulenists in the media reported on corruption of the Erdogan government. Is that correct?
If I can just
Break, that's
jump
when
in.
you, okay,
Um,
jump in at that point, then we'll go to my colleagues.
They were released recordings of conversations or alleged conversations between government officials, including Erdogan and his family members and other members of
Right.
his circle, that were leaked on social media first. And from there on, the media picked them up.
But
So
the-
they were first
but-
leaked
but the
on
actual-
the media,
but
on
the
the social
actual
media.
Releases were releases concerning
Corruption.
corruption, right. It's an important
Correct.
distinction between somebody who gets mad because his children are being talked about in a bad way on the social media versus somebody who's angry because his corrupt practices that was enriching him and his family have been exposed. It's a big difference. It's yours. Mr. Meeks.
Mr. Chairman, as indicated in my opening statements, I'm, always concerned about democracy and democratic institutions. So, my first question would be, was any members of the parliament allegedly a part of the coup d'etat? Does anybody know? From any parties? Any arrested or charged with anything or dismissed from the parliament or anything of that nature?
There are charges against some of the Kurdish members of the parliament, but not specifically about the coup.
Right, I'm talking about the coup. I'm talking specifically about the coup at this point. Okay.
Not the parliament member, but brother of Şaban Dişli, Deputy General Director of AKP, was reported, Mehmet Dişli, Major General Mehmet Dişli was reported to be among the coup makers. And in fact, Akar testified that he put a gun on his head to sign off the coup statement. However, strangely, when Akar was saved from Akıncı base, Mehmet Dişli, Major General Mehmet Dişli was with him arriving the presidency. And on the 16th morning, Mehmet Dişli, Major General Mehmet Dişli, brother of Şaban Dişli, AKP Deputy General Director, arrived to the Prime Ministry with Akar,
Right.
Chief of Staff.
I'm specifically focused on the parliament right
Mhm.
now. And
That's the only connection I have.
I want to know about that because that's part of democracy. Because part of what I believe democracy also includes is elections, and there were parliamentary elections in 2015, I believe. And I don't, when I think that we should change governments, but via democratic elections. You don't like a president, you don't like a prime minister, in parliament, you remove them via elections. And so that becomes tremendously important to me. Let me also ask, because I'm trying to make sure that I understand what, if any, differences there are, particularly in dealing with journalists. Are the journalists freely able to report on the failed coup in the aftermath and what took place in Turkey? And B, how would you describe how journalists, or the differences between how journalists are treated in Turkey as opposed to Russia?
Well, the answer to the first question is plain and simple no. They're not freely able to report on the coup or on any other sensitive issues. Turkey has been using overly broad anti-terror laws for months before the coup, but now there's plain and simple no independent and opposition media to be voicing an alternative version of events to what the government is broadcasting happened during the July events. As I said before, more than 100 media outlets were shut down directly after the coup, and these figures, the 100 detained, the 46 broadcasters shut down and accreditation taken, are merely a snapshot that were taken a couple of weeks after the coup. The events on the ground are evolving, and unfortunately to the worse for journalists. So chances are there are many, many more journalists detained. But as far as we know, there is no alternative voices that are available on the ground at the moment, minus the social media, Twitter, which has also been under attack in Turkey. And in regard to the comparison with Russia, well, in the months before the coup, I personally had made this comparison between the tactics that President Putin had been taking for in regards to the Russian media for the past 10 years and what Mr. Erdogan had been able to achieve in the matter of a couple of years. In 3 or 4 years, Erdogan and his government were able to achieve the level of censorship in Turkey and Turkish media that the Russian government had been able to achieve within 10 years.
Let me ask Mr. Stein, how have coups in Turkey's past affected TU's relationship to the United States and within NATO? And how do you see this failed coup playing out in relation to others?
I think this coup attempt differs because it wasn't successful. And so what you had is a group of military officers who did not succeed in their mission, which was, I think, first and foremost to decapitate the government. And because of that, because of the purges, I do think you'll have an effect on the Turkish NATO relationship, largely because general fear or skepticism about Western institutions is very high in Turkey right now. A lot of the forces involved in the Istanbul component of the coup attempt were part of NATO's rapid deployable force. And so it breeds a conspiracy theory that NATO must have also known about the coup beforehand. And so when you begin to lose officers who are exposed to NATO, or operating within NATO, obviously it creates friction between the two. And I would say just generally, when there are large-scale purges going on in any institution, people operating in those institutions are less free to speak their minds or to speak critically of their superiors, and so you will have a tendency within the armed forces basically to run everything up the chain of command so that you aren't sort of accused of stepping out of line or stepping too far out of line, and so things will begin to slow down all throughout Turkey, at least in decision-making processes, and be made at the highest levels.
Okay. Last question would be to Mr. McCoskey. One of the things that I believe also sometimes threatens democracy is when countries get so nationalized, nationalism. So I'd like to ask you, what are the consequences of the rise of Turkish nationalism? And within that rise, are there any liberal voices calling for the protection of institutions, regardless of the party in power that's remained, that we need to talk to or get close to or understand, get a better understanding of what's going on?
Well, I think the primary consequence of the rise of nationalism is that it will make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to repair relations between Turks and Kurds. There had been a peace process. That peace process fell apart actually last year. And I think it's now clear, I think President Erdogan has made clear there will now be all-out war on the PKK. And the sort of scorched earth policies of attacks in the southeast will alienate the population, already has alienated the population. But I think fighting the PKK has great support in Turkey. It always has, and actually I know I refer to polls a lot, but there was one recently, which is the terrorist group that threatens us the most, and PKK was far and away number 1. Fethullah Gulen, number 2, ISIS, number 3. I think that will be the primary result. Are there liberal voices? Yes, there are still liberal voices. And I think particularly from the secular opposition party, center-left party, there's been a lot of criticism, particularly lately, about the purge. There was initially nationwide support for the purge, but lately the leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, of that party has been speaking out against its excesses, and also, I think, speaking out against some of the excesses against the Kurds. So there are liberal voices. Also, I would just say in the media, I don't think we ought to think it's North Korea. What it is a very random process. There are still journalists you can read that criticize the government. I think if you look at the Hurriyet Daily News today, you'll see a couple of op-eds that are critical of the government. The problem is the journalists never know when that pink slip is going to come. And so and of course they do a lot of self-censorship. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Stein, going back to the military situation. The U.S. military is obviously caught between a rock and a hard place. And this anti-American, how about all the dependents? Isn't there a restriction now on American military personnel, their families being outside the wires, so to speak, where before it was, you could visit the whole country and anywhere, right? Isn't that in effect right now?
Yes, it is.
And the same thing with Insulik, even though we have a lot of military operations, everything is under the total control of the Turks in terms of airspace and everything that goes on there.
That's also correct, yes.
Yeah, and you kind of alluded to it. Yeah, I know it's a NATO ally, I know everything like that, but we got to face reality. If they want to shut down all U.S. American operations tomorrow, they could do it because they control everything. The comment I made about the F-35s, do you have any reaction to that question that I referred to? Your feelings? Yes, no, maybe?
Well, I think Turkey it's a tier 3 partner in the program and has obviously invested money in it, and they will host both the maintenance facility, I believe, for the engines inside Turkey, and are producing fuselages for the program. So yes, I think it should be approved.
Even with the fact that getting that technology, their new friends are the Russians, why not just give it to the Chinese or sell it to the Chinese, which is the rationale why we're developing that weapon, right?
I think it's important to distinguish between, say, the Russian, Chinese potential adversaries and a NATO ally. So, but I do think that there are frictions over sort of.
Okay, sometimes I get it mixed up. Snowden stopped off in China, then he went to Moscow. So maybe I'm old and I get him confused sometimes. I'm very, very, very worried about the Kurds. This is our ally. We had talked about them. We've deserted them in the past with the history in the Middle East, and it's like, here we go again. And yeah, they've been, and I see it's not going to be just the PKK. I think they want, quite frankly, I think they're going to kill a number of them because of the population demographics and the fact that they can have a political influence. And this is obviously the opportunity to finally eliminate the Kurds as a political threat once and for all. Do you agree with that premise?
No, I don't. I think that they took a different tactic between 2013 and 2015 to try and reach political concessions. But one of the previous Mr. Meeks' question about the rise of nationalism and perhaps poor decision-making by elected leaders is that you can lose touch with your population and then you can have a return to an insurgency in the southeast, and I don't see a way out of that. But no, I don't think that the plan is to eradicate the Kurds in Turkey.
Well, not completely, but to the point where they are going to be a viable third party in Turkey. I believe it's 11%. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I believe at the last election it was 10.7, about 11%, yes.
And the threshold's 11, right?
10.
And you don't think there's going to be any type of discrimination to push them over the border or eliminate that? Almost similar to the Russians in Chechnya in terms of some of their policies.
No, I don't think so. Although if their poll numbers do drop below 10%, you could have the AKP government contemplate early elections.
Okay, last question, I guess, going back to Russia. You know, a year ago, those of us in the NATO arena, we're worried about the SNAP exercises, flying in over Kaliningrad, everything like that, and the three countries that a lot of the NATO theorists thought would destroy the NATO alliance were Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Latvia, because they have such a high number of, Jerry's looking at me, Russian speakers. And now I'm saying here's a golden opportunity for Putin to grant his wish, and that is to destroy the NATO alliance. And you wouldn't not suggest that right now, instead of concentrating on those nations, this is a golden opportunity for Putin to finally separate, get Turkey out of the NATO alliance system for all intents and purposes. I think he would destroy it. No comment, or anybody?
I do think that there are parallels between Putin's current strategy versus how the Russians have historically approached, say, East Germany during the Cold War, and exactly why it's important to lean in and continue to engage with Turkey and perhaps.
No. I meant in relation to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Okay. Anyone? No one agrees? Okay. I think I'm used up. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel, and let's just note from everything that I've read about the F-35, well, maybe we should give it to the Turks at this point. We wouldn't necessarily be doing them a favor, from what I understand. Mr. Weber.
West?
Oh,
With the
Mr. Weber
permission
has
of the chair.
yielded to Mr. Conley.
I thank my friend from Texas. I'm here both as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and as the co-chairman of the Congressional Caucus on Turkey. I happen to believe that the U.S.-Turkey relationship is a very strategic and critical one. It's not one that can be dispensed with. I also happen to believe that it is in Europe's interest to see ultimate Turkey integration with the West and with Europe. I, however, share the concern of the chairman and my colleagues that President Erdogan, in his desire to consolidate power after a thwarted coup that, and by the way, the thwarting of the coup had universal sympathy. It had political sympathy in Turkey among the opposition parties. It had virtually complete sympathy here in the West. It was condemned by all the right people. And in a very short period of time, politically, by overreaching, it would seem that President Erdogan has actually lost sympathy. And I am very concerned about crackdown on the press, crackdown on political dissent, crackdown on political opposition, and of course, using the coup perhaps as a pretext to get at any and all Gulenists, real or perceived. And Mr. Makovsky, I know that the chairman was going to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit more about Gulen, and I'd welcome anybody else, but I met with a Turkish delegation recently, and from my point of view, look, the rule of law applies to you and to us. And you don't get to demand someone's extradition as sort of some kind of symbol of our undying support. The burden is on the government of Turkey to present evidence that would meet any reasonable legal threshold to justify the extradition of any individual, including Mr. Gulen, no matter how unpopular he may be in your ruling circle. And the fact that we don't do that in no way can be construed or should be construed as lack of support of this government for your government. I wonder if you'd comment on that, because I was alarmed by the seeming lack of appreciation for what to us is a fairly simple legal precept. And you can expand on Gulen with the consent of the chair.
I completely agree with you, Congressman. I think it's been difficult for the Turks to understand, and those who do in the leadership understand have certainly not tried to educate their public, that this process is about hard evidence. And just as you said, if the hard evidence is there, then almost certainly Mr. Gulen will be extradited. As I understand it, this process is primarily done in the Justice Department. They decide if it's worth sending to the courts. If the courts decide he's extraditable, I mean, there can be an appeal process, but assuming that he is deemed extraditable, the State Department has final sign-off, and the State Department has the right to make sure before signing off that he will receive a fair trial and humane treatment. But that is the basic process. If the hard evidence isn't there, he cannot be extradited. Look, I just wanted to say something regarding the movement, the Gulen movement itself, because it's very hard to separate now discussion of post-coup Turkey from a discussion of the nature of the Gulen movement. I think there are two very positive and significant hallmarks of the movement that distinguish it from a lot of Islamic movements, particularly radical movements that we've become very familiar with in this century and earlier, and that is they established a lot of schools that focused on subjects like math and science instead of religion, and they preached a message of peace and tolerance and interfaith comity. That said, however, I think there is now a strong set of circumstantial evidence that Gulenists have used the institutions of the Turkish state in order to pursue their enemies. This was particularly true with, or is widely believed to have been the case with the judicial actions against primarily military, but other military officers, but all other secularists in 2008 through 2010. And many innocent people now free. Now the conviction has been overturned, but many innocent people suffered and went to jail because of that. I think there is some strong reason to believe that Gulenists were involved and were driving the process. That said, the fact that followers of Mr. Gulen may have been involved in such things, or even in the coup, doesn't make Mr. Gulen himself guilty. And I think that's what has to be decided through the evidence presented by the Turks in the extradition case.
I thank the chairman and my good friend Mr. Weber for their courtesy.
Do you yield back to Mr. Weber?
Certainly do.
Mr. Weber, you are recognized.
Thank you. Would you slide his questions over here to me? Dr. Stein, you said in your comments, if I understood correctly, that it was hard to put your finger on why Turkey was so important abroad. Is that what you said?
What I meant is it's hard to point to one single thing. You can replace air bases, but it's hard to replace the idea of a strong transatlantic relationship. And so it's that nebulous idea of strong transatlantic ties that makes Turkey most important.
Okay, well, let me do it this way then. How about if we just use one word, geography?
That's a good word.
Okay, so you would agree that if for no other reason their geographical location is fairly strategic?
Absolutely.
Okay. I rest my case, Your Honor. I thought so. I mean, it's extremely important, especially with Syria and all of the unrest, and we need that ally. And of course, I could go into energy pipelines and the finds in the Mediterranean Sea and the islands of Cyprus and just on and on and on. But Turkey is a very, very strategic, in my opinion, country that we need to be absolutely sure we take every necessary step, reasonable step, to keep them as friendly to the United States as we can. Having said that, I think it was, pronounce your last name for me, ma'am. Ogianova? Okay. I think it was you who said that you begin your daily chronicle of the problems with the media in March of 2016? Are you a Turkish citizen?
No, I'm not a Turkish citizen, nor am I an American citizen, but I have been covering Turkey for since 2012. And what I said in relation to that daily documentation was I wanted to stress when we were compelled to start a daily chronicle of coverage on Turkey. We've always covered Turkey like any other country.
From 2012.
I have covered Turkey since 2012. CPJ has been covering it for years and years on end.
Okay.
It came on my personal purview in 2012, and since then we've been covering Turkey very regularly. But this March, we were compelled to start a daily chronicle
Okay.
on press freedom in Turkey.
But you would readily admit that those kinds of abuses of power had been going on for years.
Oh, absolutely. They have been going on for years, but it was this year that they reached catastrophic proportions,
Okay.
and we were compelled to start covering press freedom issues daily.
Were you
We
doing-
basically became a wire service for press freedom on Turkey on a daily basis in March.
Were you doing it from inside the country or from afar?
Well, we are headquartered in New York, but we have
But I'm
a
talking about you. I'm
correspondent.
talking about you personally, and I don't mean to pry. If that's okay.
I'm the coordinator of the program, so in my program, apart from Turkey, I cover 30 other countries.
So you weren't in Turkey itself.
I go to Turkey every year, but our correspondent on the ground is the one who feeds us the daily chronicle of events.
Okay. And
He's
you
the
m-
reporter on
Okay,
the
and
ground.
I think you mentioned later in the discussion that there are still some reporters or some media that still criticize the government, but they're kind of self-regulated.
Well, there are individual journalists and some news outlets on the margins that do that, but they do that at an enormous personal risk. They could be prosecuted at the whim of the government at any time.
And so
And
my-
now that we have the state of emergency, the
stakes are much higher.
absolutely, and
So
all
my-
the parliamentary judiciary
Well,
scrutiny is gone.
Forgive me,
from
but let
these
me break in here.
prosecutions.
I don't want to run over too much time.
Mhm.
Not that some others haven't. Would you say the number of media organizations has gone from 300 in 2012, for example, to 50? Can you give me those numbers?
I can tell you how many were purged. More than 100 in a matter of 2 weeks. Those are the hard numbers.
Okay, when was that 2 weeks?
2 weeks after the coup attempt.
Oh, isn't that
We
amazing?
registered more than 100 being closed down. Since then, there were more that were closed down, but we captured that statistic 2 weeks after the coup.
Okay. Dr. Stein, I'm going to come back to you. In your discussion with Colonel Cook, I think you mentioned that there's anti-U.S. sentiment. Would you say it was building before the coup attempt, or was that primarily since the coup attempt?
The United States has never really been all that popular inside Turkey, so levels of anti-Americanism has always been high, but it's been, it's reached new levels. It's levels I've never seen before, and things that escape detection. Prominent people on their sort of equivalent of cable talk shows going on television every single night and pointing to CIA involvement.
Did that grow when Erdogan, in the last, say, 6 years since he's begun to dismantle the Constitution?
I would say it's grown most heavily in the past year with the breakdown of the peace process and our actions in Syria.
Okay, I'm concerned about the military base established in 1951, 3,300 acres in an area in Incirlik. Is that how you say that? Incirlik. In an urban area of 1.7 million people. The colonel alluded to that, them being inside the compound proper, or the base. Are they in danger? Are the military personnel there on our base, are they in danger? Yes, sir. Go ahead, Dr. Yala.
I believe they are in danger. And the reason for that, after the coup, pro-Erdogan media finger-pointed Americans so harshly that people on the street, because they cannot feed themselves with other free media, started to believe that the coup was really carried out by the Americans or with their support.
Okay. Now, somebody else said that, was it Twitter was under attack? How so?
In the many cases of detentions of journalists, prosecutions of journalists, those detentions have happened in retaliation for tweets, not simply articles published or
It's
broadcast.
not the Twitter company per se, but whoever's doing the tweeting.
Whoever is doing the tweeting is being prosecuted, detained, etc. But we have to say that the Twitter as a company has censored a number of accounts
Okay.
on the questions and the requests of the Turkish government.
Okay.
And we are now trying to figure out why they have done
So
that.
we're losing civil rights hand over fist. Now, Fethullah Gulen, by all accounts, one of you said it, is multiculturalism, diversity, and he's doing some good work in terms of schools. Is that y'all's general consensus in the panel here? Dr. Stein?
He's not new in Turkish society, and I think the allegations that he is an insidious character in Turkish society has been around since the 1970s, and that's why the purges have such wide-scale support. Nobody really likes him because while he does good work, because he does set up charter schools, sometimes violating our own laws in terms of fair hiring practices, he is widely believed to be instructing his followers to infiltrate Turkish institutions to try and remake the Turkish state.
Dr. Yala, do you concur with that?
No, I don't, but it is very difficult to talk about it because as soon as I speak, I'm going to be blamed as to be Gulenist, but however, I have to speak the truth. I spent years on the ground to fight against terrorism, and I raided several thousand apartment flats because of the 911 calls saying that or tipping that there are terrorists in those flats, especially in Ankara. And this happened in Istanbul several occasions. And with those raids, we raided several Gülen flats where students were staying, deeming from the outside as terrorists. I have never, or my people, my officers, never found anything to incriminate in terms of violence related with that movement. However, if it was a terrorist organization's flat, there was always evidence.
Oh, absolutely.
And then I think Gülenist people came out in regards to radicalism and jihadi terrorism, especially after 9/11 and with the ISIS, as the strongest voices against terrorism. Gülen himself was one of the few persons came out, said a terrorist cannot be a Muslim cannot be terrorist.
Let me move over here to Mr. McCoskey, but before I do, you had a son that was arrested,
Yes.
and what's his status?
My son was arrested when he was leaving legally from the border because my passport was cancelled.
He's still under arrest?
He's still under arrest, and he was released. As soon as he was released, he was rearrested in front of the prison again.
Okay, and how
The
long?
only charge is being my passport is
Has
cancelled.
that been since July 15th?
Oh yeah, after I wrote an article saying that I don't believe this was a real coup.
Well, we wish him the best, and hopefully
Thank
he'll
you.
be able to get out. Mr. McCoskey, do you agree with the statement that generally speaking, Gulen is viewed as doing some pretty good things?
You're talking about within Turkey.
Well, we would say over here, well, it's just that you make an interesting point, here and in Turkey.
Look, as I said, he's, I think, viewed by many people because of the nature of the schools, and the teachings. He's viewed by many people here as something hopeful, a hopeful sign in the Islamic world. In Turkey, there has been, I think, widespread criticism of him. He was
More so since July 15th?
Well, absolutely.
Okay.
If I could.
So Erdogan has, you would argue perhaps, has been successful in making him part of the scapegoat.
Yeah, he's been demonizing him.
Okay.
And there's no doubt there is a vendetta, particularly since December 2013, as
Okay.
we discussed earlier.
Let
with
me
the
move
Coup.
on. I'm way over if I may. And can I just call you Nina? Do you agree with that assessment?
Go ahead.
That
Well, I haven't seen any evidence against.
but
Mr.
you're reading
Hiller.
all the tweets.
And I think that we should come from the presumption of innocence, and everyone should be innocent before proven guilty.
Sure.
And that has been the biggest issue with this crackdown, is that it's continuing without us having seen any evidence against these
Well,
detainees.
how many prearranged warrants did one of you say there was? How many people were arrested within a couple of days with hours?
I mean, hundreds of warrants.
Right.
But in
Well,
terms of
July
journalists,
16th, the very next day, 2,745 judges were
And,
arrested.
if you do the math on that, if you signed a warrant a minute, that's 2,500 minutes. Okay?
I mean, no wonder that now the prisons are being cleaned of actual convicted criminals, so that there could be enough space for the detainees after the coup plot. I
Yeah.
think what's really important is to note that the cancellation of passports is a critical issue at the moment, and many civilians have been canceled their passports. Journalists, civil activists, and their families, like we see in the case of Dr. Yaila. And we should be very vigilant about that. The US leaders should not recognize these canceled passports.
Well, thank you. I'm way over time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, to bring this hearing to a close, we're going to ask Mr. Meeks any questions he has about the Glennis movement, but anything else, and to have a wrap-up statement.
Well, I don't have any specific question about the Glennis movement. I think that it's a complicated scenario. I think the entire relationship and where we are with Turkey is very complicated. When I look at the scenario and this nationalism, I know, and the passion of nationalism generally also creates emotionalism, whether it's in Turkey or whether it's in the United States or wherever it may be. I do know that we have a firm commitment to make sure that wherever, in Turkey and Russia and the United States, where there's violation of human rights, where we don't have freedom of the press, where we don't have sound institutions, we've got to speak out. We can't be silent about that. We can't just allow it to go. That does not mean that we want to be enemies or anything of that nature. That means we want the same things for all people. Human rights, freedom to determine your own self-determination. And when any of those things are not happening, I think we need voices to speak out loudly and clearly. And if you don't feel, for me, not equating the two, but what's great about the United States, in my estimation, is when I've got a scenario like Colin Kaepernick, he has the freedom to express his, well, you say it's his ignorance. It's the freedom of this country, because if you say Turkey, they will say it's ignorance also with something that we disagree with, and that's why it's complicated. But you should have the freedom to express yourself, because people feel differently. I mean, for example, for us, our number one enemy is Daesh or ISIL, because we feel threatened by them. To the Turks, it's the PKK, because they feel threatened by them. So we can't self-impose how they feel and say, well, you should feel exactly the way we feel, and if you don't feel the way we feel, you're wrong. Nor should they. And that's kind of where we are. And I think Mr. Stein said, yes, geography does have a lot to do with it. Yes, the fact that there are NATO allies, it has a lot to do with it. Yes, because we want to make sure that we are not condemning the entire Muslim population, has something to do with it. If you have moderate Islamic countries, we want to make sure that we are engaging with them. We don't want to get rid of them. That's why it's important, and that's why I think also in the United States we have Muslims, we have Christians, and they all should be welcome. So my summary is there's a lot of work and thought and negotiations that has to happen here. This is not a simple matter of you're right and you're wrong. It is a matter, though, that I think that is unquestioned, that the number of individuals that have been arrested and detained, and the journalists, is a violation of human rights, that they're entitled to hearings and jurisprudence and should be returned, and it should not be something that is wrong. And we've got to speak out about that loudly and clearly, even if they're an ally. But also understand that we're doing this because we want to work together, and our relationship is so important that we've got to figure this thing out. And I thank the witnesses for your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks, and I'll just a couple short questions, and then I'll do a little wrap-up. In terms of the Glenists, let me ask, so far it sounds like you're the only one who believes that the Glenists, or at least some Glenists, are involved with a non-democratic approach to power, meaning being willing to be part of the coup and things such as that. First, let's ask Mr. Stein.
I won't speak for my panelists, other panelists, although I would presume that others probably
Well, I'm
think
gonna ask them in a
alongside, think as well as, think like I do. I think the Turkish people think that, and I think it's important if we want to understand how they're
What do
approaching the
you
post.
believe? You're a specialist. Do you believe that the Glenists were the organizing force behind this coup?
I can't speak to that because I haven't seen any evidence to that.
Okay, so you
But
don't
were
know.
they infiltrating Turkish institutions? Absolutely.
Okay, but you don't know, and that's your answer to that question.
I don't know because the events of July 15th have not been told in full detail.
Okay, whatever the reason. I mean, you're an expert in a lot of these areas, including this, but there's not information enough for you to have made up your mind on that.
No, I haven't seen
What about
evidence.
you, Mr. Yalala?
I don't believe that Gülenists were behind the coup because I have worked with several high-level generals in the military, in the field, and most of the generals and high-level commanders in the military are known with their strong secularist approaches, and many of them do not like or hate Gülen, so I don't buy that.
Okay, so it's no.
As I tried to explain earlier to Mr. Connolly's question, perhaps I did so fairly inarticulately, I agree with Dr. Stein that there is strong circumstantial evidence that Gülenists have infiltrated, tried to infiltrate the...
That's not the question.
The question is about, if you're just about the coup,
That's correct.
I think we know nothing at this point about the coup.
Okay, so we
And-
don't
and I-
know. So your answer is you don't know because we don't know enough you don't know if the Glenists were involved in the organizing of the coup or not. Okay, and
Absolutely concur with Ms. Markovsky, and I also want to add that the persons who are qualified to make investigations and independent investigations in the media about the coup plot are now intimidated into silence. So not only don't we know what happened, but those who are able to help us know more are they incarcerated or exiled?
so I see we don't know, but one of the reasons we don't know is because the current the government is cutting off information sources to give us an accurate assessment whether or not even the charge. However, we do have one witness today, Mr. Yala, who served as a high-level intelligence officer in the police and in terms of confronting terrorism, and he has a long history involved and says that he does not believe the Glenists were involved in organizing the coup. So we have that as the answer for that question. In general, do you see, obviously the Glenists are trying to be portrayed as a conspiratorial organization. By the way, do Glenists go to a particular church or mosque? Do they do things in public? They just have private meetings, that's it?
That is my understanding. I've asked Gulenis this question, and they said they do not pray at their own mosques.
And
So
they-
that adds to sort of the aura of mystery
Right.
for many Turks. No one knows exactly.
Well, I
who-
know that we had a problem in our country with a group of people who had a interesting philosophy. They were called Masons. And early in our country's history, there was this Masonic conspiracy that was supposedly around. But I looked at it, and I've read history. I'm a history major, and I've done a lot of reading on it. George Washington was a Mason, and all the rest of these people. And it seems to me what they had was a group of people who have shared values. And although they were private and did not make everything public, it was far from a conspiracy to try to take over governments, et cetera, although Masons had a lot of influence here. Not enough influence to justify overthrowing George Washington and his government because George Washington was a Mason. We also, today, we have determined that that before the coup attempt, we already had signs of tyranny and repression, and even more so, more important, corruption in Erdogan's government, perhaps leading all the way up to Erdogan himself. The fact is that before there was reporting on that corruption, Erdogan himself did not seem to have any trouble with the Gülenists. But the Gülenists felt obligated to report it, knowing it would break their camaraderie, their tie to the man in power. That indicates something good to me. That doesn't indicate something bad to me. That indicates that you've got people who are courageous enough, knowing that their children could be arrested even by what appears to be someone who is becoming a megalomaniac. That sounds like a courageous group of people to me. As I say, there are people who are in parts of groups like this who are good people and bad people. Maybe there's some bad people too. We don't know. But I think that the fact that Turkey was, and the Turkish government was clearly involved with repressing opposition prior to the coup, and immediately after the coup, arrested thousands and thousands of people immediately after the coup, indicate, many of whom could not have possibly had anything to do with the coup, suggests to us that today we've got to be very concerned about the nature of Mr. Erdogan's government. If he wants to use this as an excuse to eliminate real democratic rights of his people, if he wants to use this as an excuse to perhaps sever bonds with the West we're so upset with or whatever, if he uses this as an excuse to, for example, to call off elections, to end democratic things, right? As if there's a state of emergency right now, that there's an army of Gülenists at the door, ready to take over the country. So thus we have to arrest more people and shut up more newspapers. And this is it's not only unacceptable. It is an historic disaster for the people of Turkey. And again, let's go back to the fundamental, and that is the people of Turkey have been good friends of the United States. We need to be concerned about them. And we need to basically not only pray for them if we're religious, and pray for them and that they come out of this, but also do what we can to at least ease this government over into the right direction. And we can't do it by not admitting the challenge that we have, however. We can't do it by trying to cover up the fact that Erdogan, and by the way, so when did Erdogan break with the Gülenists? When they started reporting on corruption that directly affected his entourage in government. So this is what everybody needs to know. Now, with that said, thank you all for testifying today. We I would, this is, you know, we're having a crazy political year here in the United States. It's about the craziest year I've ever seen. And what's going on in Turkey and this people, which will change everything. I mean, the alliance and the stability that we've had, if Turkey goes with more radical, more anti-Western forces that are at play in Europe, the stability that we've had is going to go right out the window. It's going to change the history of the world. So let's pray that people who do believe in a more free society and acceptance and open societies and believe in peace and harmony with their neighbors, let's hope that these are the people that come to power not only in Turkey but throughout the Mideast. So with that said, this adjourned.